I have been a licensed land surveyor for over 15 years. My job is precise. It's calculated. I deal in absolute truths defined by legal descriptions, ancient monuments, and state law. In my line of work, there is no room for interpretation. A boundary is a boundary. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I prefer the quiet reliability of my theodolite and total station to social interaction. But I value my property rights, and I value the rule of law. 3 years ago, I bought a peaceful, wooded 3-acre lot at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The gem of this property was the Guardian, a monstrously large, perfectly healthy white oak tree, estimated to be at least 150 years old. I custom designed my house around it. It was positioned perfectly on the rear boundary of my lot, casting shade over my deck. Enter the new Homeowners Association president, Brent. Brent was a former low-tier real estate developer with the charisma of a greasy used car salesman and the ego of a small-town dictator. He immediately set out to modernize the subdivision. This meant standardized fencing, expensive landscaping requirements, and an overall hostility toward anyone who didn't want their property to look like a soulless suburban copy-paste job. From day one, Brent hated my tree. He claimed it looked wild and disorderly. He tried to convince the HOA board that it was a hazard, despite 3 independent arborist reports I provided, proving it was perfectly healthy. When the board didn't back him, Brent started issuing fine after fine for arbitrary aesthetic violations. Fines I ignored, knowing they were legally unenforceable. But Brent wasn't used to being ignored. He decided to take matters into his own hands, leading to a catastrophic day that would cost him everything. The morning it happened, I was out of town on a complex boundary dispute in the northern part of the state. I remember the exact moment my phone started vibrating. It was a series of frantic alerts from my Ring camera. I opened the app and my blood turned to ice. A commercial tree service crew was on my property. They had a massive wood chipper idling at the curb and a bucket truck positioned right next to my white oak. And there was Brent, wearing a neon vest he probably bought just for the occasion, pointing at the branches of my tree with the authority of a general ordering an invasion. I tried calling him. No answer. I called the local police, but by the time a cruiser arrived 45 minutes later, the damage was irreversible. White oaks are resilient, but not against 3 professional chainsaws and a man with a vendetta. They hadn't just trimmed it, they had topped it, a practice that is essentially a death sentence for a tree of that age. They hacked off the main canopy, leaving jagged, bleeding stumps exposed to the sun and pests. Brent told the responding officer that he was executing an emergency safety abatement authorized by the HOA, claiming a storm was coming and the tree was an imminent threat to the power lines. It was a blatant, calculated lie. The power lines were 60 feet away on the opposite side of the street. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, the silence was deafening. The majestic canopy that used to filter the afternoon sun was gone. In its place was a skeletal, mutilated wreck. Sawdust covered my deck like snow. I didn't scream. I didn't rush over to Brent's house to start a fight. In my profession, emotions are a liability. Precision is a weapon. I walked out to the stump of a massive limb they had dropped, took out my professional-grade tape measure, and started documenting. The first thing I realized, looking at the fresh cuts, was that they hadn't just stayed on their side of the invisible line. To get the angles they wanted for the abatement, the crew had trespassed 20 feet into my property with heavy machinery, crushing my expensive underground drainage system. But then, I looked closer at the rear property line where Brent's yard met mine. I noticed something he had overlooked. In his haste to beautify the area, Brent had recently installed a massive, stone-clad outdoor kitchen and a retaining wall right against the back edge of his lot. I went inside, sat at my workstation, and pulled up the original subdivision plats from 1954 and the most recent GIS data. I cross-referenced them with the monuments I had personally verified when I bought the place. A slow, predatory smile formed on my face. Brent thought he was the king of this neighborhood, but he had built his kingdom on shifting sand and, quite literally, on land that didn't belong to him. I wasn't just going to sue him for the tree, I was going to use my license to dismantle his entire life, inch by agonizing inch. I spent the next 6 hours drafting the most expensive notice of survey the HOA had ever seen. The next morning, I didn't head to my office. Instead, I unloaded over $30,000 worth of Leica surveying equipment from my truck. I set up my total station on a known benchmark, a brass disc set in concrete at the entrance of the cul-de-sac. I was going to perform a standard land boundary survey, but with a level of precision usually reserved for skyscrapers or bridges. I wasn't just looking for my property line. I was looking for every single deviation Brent had committed since he took office. As I worked, Brent walked out onto his back deck, holding a coffee mug, looking smug. "Morning, neighbor," he shouted with a fake, condescending cheerfulness. "Decided to finally do something about that messy lot of yours? Shame about the tree. But safety first, right?" I didn't look up from my viewfinder. I didn't say a word. In the world of high-stakes litigation, anything I said to him could be used to claim personal animosity. I needed this to be purely about the math. Silence is a surveyor's best shield. By noon, I had the data, and it was even better than I had hoped. I spent the afternoon in my home office processing the points in Civil 3D. The results were a masterpiece of disaster for Brent. First, the tree law aspect. In our state, white oaks are protected, and timber trespass carries a mandatory treble damages penalty. I called a friend of mine, a forensic arborist who specializes in court testimony. He arrived 2 hours later. After examining the mutilated oak, his face was grim. "It's a total loss," he said. "The structural integrity is compromised. Within 2 years, it'll rot and become a real hazard. The replacement cost for a white oak of this caliber, including the crane work to drop a mature specimen into a residential lot, is roughly $85,000. I nodded. $85,000 times 3 for the treble damages meant Brent was already looking at a $250,000 bill just for the wood. But that was just the appetizer. The survey data revealed the nuclear option. Brent's luxury outdoor kitchen, his heated saltwater pool, and the massive stone retaining wall were not just close to the line, they were over it. When Brent built them, he had used a handyman contractor who didn't bother with a permit or a survey, likely because Brent, as HOA president, thought he could approve his own projects. The data showed that his entire outdoor entertainment complex encroached onto a non-buildable conservation easement by exactly 4.2 feet. This easement wasn't just private property, it was a protected drainage corridor owned by the county to prevent flooding in the lower basin. By building there, Brent hadn't just trespassed on me, he had violated federal environmental regulations regarding watershed management. I printed out the certified survey maps, stamped them with my official state surveyor seal, and prepared 3 packages. One for my lawyer, one for the county building inspector, and one for the Department of Environmental Quality. I also included the high-definition footage from my Ring camera showing Brent personally directing the destruction of the tree. I wasn't going for a settlement. I was going for a total liquidation of his assets. I sent the first cease and desist letter via a process server that evening. When the server handed Brent the papers while he was hosting a dinner party for the HOA board, I watched through my window. The color didn't just leave his face. He looked like he was about to have a stroke. The cease and desist was just the opening move, a psychological primer to let Brent know that the quiet man next door wasn't just a victim, but a predator who spoke the language of the law. 2 days later, the real weight of my profession began to crush him. I didn't just file a lawsuit. I triggered a bureaucratic chain reaction that no HOA president, no matter how influential in a small pond, could stop. The county building inspector, a man named Miller who had dealt with Brent's shortcut construction projects in the past, arrived at 8 a.m. I met him at the curb with my certified survey in hand. I pointed to the brass pins I had set the day before. Using a laser level, I showed him exactly where Brent's $120,000 outdoor oasis crossed the line into the county conservation easement. Miller's expression was one of grim satisfaction. "He didn't pull a single permit for this, did he?" Miller asked, though he already knew the answer. In our jurisdiction, building on a conservation easement is a Tier 1 violation. It's not a fine you just pay and move on. It's an order for immediate restoration of the land to its original state. While Miller was tagging Brent's back door with a bright orange notice of violation, my attorney was filing the civil suit for timber trespass. We weren't just asking for the value of the tree. We invoked the full replacement cost doctrine. In tree law, if a tree is unique or provides specific utility, like the primary shade for a residence, the defendant can be held liable for the cost of bringing in a tree of the same size and maturity. You can't just buy a 150-year-old white oak at Home Depot. To replace the Guardian, Brent would need to pay for a specialized forestry company to find a similar tree, excavate a root ball the size of a small house, transport it via a multi-axle oversized load trailer, and hire a 100-ton crane to lift it over my house. The estimate? $285,000. And because it was willful and malicious, that number was legally subject to tripling. By noon, Brent was in my driveway, his face a deep, unhealthy shade of purple. He wasn't smug anymore. He was desperate, which made him even more dangerous. "You're insane!" he screamed, waving the orange violation notice. "This is a minor encroachment. I'll just pay the county a variance fee, and that tree, it was a weed. I'll give you $5,000 and we'll call it even. If you don't drop this, I'll have the HOA board vote to put a lien on your house for every single aesthetic fine I've issued you over the last year." I stood there, arms crossed, leaning against my truck. I waited for him to finish his tantrum. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke in the same flat, clinical tone I use for reading GPS coordinates. "Brent, you aren't listening. You didn't just build on my land. You built on a federally protected watershed corridor. The county doesn't grant variances for those. They protect the drainage of the entire valley. And as for the tree, my arborist has already submitted his report to the district attorney. In this state, destroying a tree of that age and value can be prosecuted as a felony-level criminal mischief. I'm not here to negotiate with you. I'm here to watch the process work." That night, the first cracks in Brent's kingdom appeared. The HOA board, sensing a sinking ship and realizing that Brent had used HOA funds to hire the tree service crew, thereby exposing the entire association to massive liability, called an emergency meeting. They didn't invite Brent. By the next morning, a letter was taped to my door. The board was officially distancing itself from Brent's actions, claiming he acted outside his authority. They were terrified. Brent was now standing alone, facing a $500,000 tree claim and a county-mandated demolition order for his prized backyard. But I was just getting started. I hadn't even mentioned the underground drainage system he had crushed with his bucket truck. That was the hidden fuse that was about to blow his financial life apart. The pressure began to mount, and Brent, true to his nature, tried to fix the situation with more lies. He hired a cut-rate surveyor, a guy known in the industry for being flexible with his measurements. I saw them out there on Saturday morning, using outdated equipment and moving quickly, trying to find a way to prove that the conservation easement wasn't where the county said it was. I sat on my porch, sipping a coffee, and watched them through my binoculars. It was like watching a child try to redraw a map to claim he owned the candy store. I knew my data was backed by high-order control points and a direct link to the state's geodetic survey. Their flexible survey wouldn't just fail in court. It would likely get that surveyor's license revoked for gross negligence. On Monday, the second phase of my plan, the hidden fuse, was ignited. Remember the bucket truck Brent hired to mutilate my tree? It weighed approximately 45,000 pounds. To get into position, they had driven it directly over the path of my custom-engineered high-capacity underground drainage system. This system wasn't just a few PVC pipes. It was a series of French drains and a massive concrete cistern designed to manage the heavy runoff from the hill behind our properties. By midweek, we had a typical spring downpour. Without the canopy of the Guardian to break the fall of the rain, and with the drainage pipes crushed under the weight of the truck, the water had nowhere to go. By 2 a.m., my Ring camera showed Brent's backyard transforming into a swamp. Because his illegal retaining wall had altered the natural flow of the watershed, the water began to pool against his foundation. I stayed up, watching the telemetry from my smart home water sensors. I knew exactly what was happening. The hydrostatic pressure was building up behind his unpermitted wall. Around 4:15 a.m., a sound like a gunshot echoed through the cul-de-sac. It was the sound of reinforced concrete reaching its breaking point. The next morning, Brent's outdoor paradise looked like a war zone. The retaining wall had buckled, shifting his expensive outdoor kitchen by 3 feet and cracking the shell of his saltwater pool. Thousands of gallons of chlorinated water were now draining directly into the soil, and because his yard was now a mud pit, that water began to undermine the very foundation of his house. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I simply picked up the phone and called my insurance company's legal department. I informed them that my neighbor's illegal construction had failed, causing a catastrophic, uncontrolled water event that was now threatening my property's soil stability. Now, Brent wasn't just facing me in the county, he was facing a multi-billion-dollar insurance conglomerate. My insurance company immediately dispatched a forensic structural engineer. When he saw the orange violation tags from the county and my certified survey proving the encroachments, his eyes lit up. This was a slam-dunk subrogation case. They wouldn't just sue Brent, they would go after his personal assets because his homeowner's insurance had a specific exclusion for damage resulting from unpermitted illegal construction. Brent was now caught in a pincer movement. On one side, he had a $750,000 tree law lawsuit, the $250,000 base multiplied by 3 for the willful clause. On the other side, he had a mandatory county order to demolish what was left of his backyard at his own expense. And now, he had a massive structural failure that his insurance refused to cover because he had played God with the property lines. I watched from my driveway as a massive for sale sign was hammered into his front lawn. But there was a problem. In our state, you cannot sell a property with an active lis pendens, notice of pending litigation, and a Tier 1 building violation. He was trapped in a house that was literally sliding into a mud pit of his own making. I decided it was time for a face-to-face. I walked over to the property line, the real one, marked by my iron pins, and waited for him to come out. When he did, he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His expensive suit was replaced by a stained t-shirt, and his hands were shaking. "What do you want?" he rasped. "I want to show you something," I said, holding up a tablet. I showed him the high-resolution scan of the underground ruins of my drainage system. "This repair alone will cost $60,000, and because you directed the truck that broke it, you're personally liable. My lawyer is filing the supplemental claim this afternoon." Brent leaned against a post, his spirit finally breaking. "I was just trying to make the neighborhood look better," he whined. "Why are you doing this? It was just one tree." "It wasn't just a tree, Brent," I replied, my voice as cold as a mountain stream. "It was a 150-year-old living monument that stood long before your grandfather was born. You thought you could erase history and ignore the law because you had a clipboard and a title. I'm a surveyor. I don't care about your titles. I care about the truth of the land. And the truth is, you don't belong here." The legal machinery of a timber trespass case moves with a slow, grinding inevitability that is designed to exhaust the defendant's spirit. By the second month of the litigation, Brent's initial bravado had been replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. My attorney, a specialist in property law, who looked at tree cases like a shark looks at a wounded seal, had filed a motion for a prejudgment attachment. This is a rare and aggressive legal maneuver that effectively freezes a defendant's assets to ensure they don't hide their money before the final judgment. Because the evidence of Brent's willful and malicious destruction was captured in 4K resolution by my cameras, the judge granted the motion. Brent's bank accounts were flagged, and a lien was placed on his vehicles. He was officially a prisoner of his own arrogance. But the real nuclear strike came from the expert testimony during the deposition phase. We didn't just hire one arborist, we hired a forensic timber valuator. This man didn't just look at the tree as wood, he looked at it as an ecosystem service provider. In his 120-page report, he detailed the white oak's contribution to the property's value. He calculated the carbon sequestration loss, the stormwater mitigation value, and, most importantly, the historical aesthetic premium. He presented a concept called the trunk formula method. He measured the diameter of the trunk, applied a species rating, a condition rating, and a location rating. When the math was done, the base value of the Guardian wasn't just $85,000. It was $112,000. Under the state's tree law, which mandates triple damages for the intentional destruction of boundary line timber, the starting point for the judgment was $336,000. And that didn't include my legal fees, the $60,000 for the crushed drainage system, or the $45,000 for the loss of quiet enjoyment during the construction of my repairs. Brent sat across the table during the deposition, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. Every time my expert cited another statute, Brent's face got a shade paler. He realized that even if he sold his house, he wouldn't have enough to pay me. He was looking at a total net worth wipeout. Meanwhile, the HOA board had completely turned on him. To save themselves from a secondary lawsuit for failure of fiduciary duty, they handed over all of Brent's private emails. It was a gold mine. In one email to the tree service company, Brent had written, "I don't care about the owner's permission. Just get it done while he's out of town. I'll take care of the fallout later. He's just a quiet nerd who won't fight back." That single sentence effectively sealed his fate. It proved malice aforethought, which opened the door for punitive damages, a category of money that insurance companies are legally prohibited from covering. Brent was now personally on the hook for a debt that could not be discharged through his policy. As the pressure from the county intensified, Brent was forced to begin the remediation of his backyard. Because the county refused to grant a variance for his encroachment on the conservation easement, he had to hire a specialized demolition crew. I spent my Saturday mornings on my deck, watching through sunglasses as a jackhammer tore apart his $120,000 outdoor kitchen. The stone counters were smashed, the custom grill was hauled away as scrap, and the saltwater pool, the crown jewel of his ego, was drained, broken into pieces, and filled with dirt. It was the most satisfying symphony of destruction I had ever heard. The man who wanted everything to look perfect and standardized now lived in a house overlooking a jagged hole of mud and broken rebar. To add the final touch of professional irony, I was the one who had to stake out the demolition lines for the county. I stood there with my GPS pole marking the exact spots where the excavators had to stop. Brent came out at one point, looking like a ghost of his former self. He didn't even yell this time. He just asked, "Are you happy now?" I looked at my data collector, checked the horizontal accuracy, 0.01 feet, and looked him in the eye. "I'm not happy or sad, Brent. I'm just precise. You moved the line. I'm just moving it back." That afternoon, the district attorney's office called. Based on the malice found in the emails, they were officially moving forward with criminal charges for criminal mischief in the first degree. Brent wasn't just losing his money, he was about to get a mugshot. The final court hearing wasn't the dramatic showdown Brent expected. There were no grand speeches or cinematic outbursts. Instead, it was a cold, methodical presentation of facts, figures, and land surveys. My attorney presented the tree law evidence alongside the malice emails, while I sat at the table, my face a mask of professional indifference. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for strictly upholding property rights, didn't even need 40 minutes to deliberate. The judgment was devastating. Brent was ordered to pay a total of $482,000. This included the tripled value of the Guardian, the full restoration of my underground drainage system, and my legal fees. But the judge didn't stop there. Because Brent had used his position as HOA President to facilitate the crime, she referred the case to the state auditor. Within weeks, it was discovered that Brent had been borrowing HOA funds to cover the initial costs of his illegal backyard construction, hoping to pay it back after selling a separate property. This transformed a civil dispute into a multi-count felony embezzlement case. Brent's life collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. To pay the judgment and avoid immediate jail time before his criminal trial, he was forced into a fire sale of his home. But since the backyard was still a mandated demolition site and the foundation issues hadn't been fully mitigated, the house sold for 40% below market value. After the bank took their cut and the judgment was paid to me, Brent was left with nothing but a mountain of debt and a criminal record. I watched from my window as the moving trucks arrived. Brent didn't even look at my house as he climbed into his car. He looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. With the settlement money, I didn't just buy a new car or go on a luxury vacation. I spent it on the land. I hired the most elite arboricultural team in the country. They couldn't bring back the original 150-year-old white oak, but they could perform a legacy planting. We brought in 3 semi-mature white oaks, each about 25 feet tall, and positioned them strategically along the boundary line. I also installed a state-of-the-art automated irrigation and monitoring system to ensure they would thrive for the next 2 centuries. These trees were now protected by a conservation easement I personally drafted and recorded with the county, ensuring that no future owner, HOA president, or developer could ever touch them without facing immediate, catastrophic legal consequences. The new neighbors who moved into Brent's old house are a quiet couple. He's an engineer, she's a librarian. They love the trees. They understand the importance of boundaries. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on my deck in the evening, I look at the spot where the Guardian once stood. The new trees are smaller, but they are strong, and they are legally untouchable. People often ask me if I regret being so nuclear with my revenge. They say, "It was just a tree. Surely a small settlement would have sufficed." I usually just smile and think about the math. In the world of surveying, if you're off by an inch at the start, you're off by miles at the end. Brent was off by more than an inch. He was off in his character, his ethics, and his respect for the law. I didn't destroy him. I simply applied the laws of the land until they reached their logical conclusion. The silence in my backyard is now peaceful, a silence earned through precision and protected by the very statutes Brent thought he was above. And every time the wind rustles the leaves of the new oaks, I'm reminded that while people like Brent come and go, the land, and the lines we draw upon it, remains.